Now, look, I know I said my next video would be the Spider-Man 2 review, and I promise that's still coming. I've edited about 15 minutes of that video at the time of writing this, with another 35 to go. It'll be here eventually. However, if I do not infodump about this new hyperfixation I have, my brain will factually explode. So now you all get to listen to me ramble about the Transfem Furry pirate novel, because I'm just that kind of person, if it was not obvious. So, to make a long story short, you may remember I released a video about Freedom Planet 2 around this same time last year, because apparently I just don't post to the channel between January and May now, since that's when I overextend myself and try to do a major project I really shouldn't have committed to.
You what?
If you haven't seen that video, I'd highly recommend going and checking it out. It's probably the video I'm still proudest of on this channel. But anyways, in that video, you probably heard me mention one of my favorite NPCs in the game, Verse. I didn't explain much about her other than making a joke about how she's trans, and yeah, I'll be completely honest, that is a large part of why I liked her so much. I mean, what can I say? I'm predictable. In Freedom Planet 2, Verse essentially serves as the in-universe justification for jukebox functionality in the hub worlds, being able to play back any of the various vinyls you find hidden around the stages. How she does that with a guitar, I'm not quite sure, but that's beside the point. What always stood out to me about Verse was her design and her dialogue with the player character. I mean, look at this sprite! Cool eye patch, long flowing hair, great color scheme. From a design standpoint, Verse already stood out among all the other NPCs in the game, which is saying something considering how incredibly well they're all designed, but her dialogue also brings her up another step. See, Verse has a very thick... I'm not actually quite sure what kind of accent this is. It's always kind of read as Australian to me, but I'm also very unknowledgeable when it comes to accents, so don't take my word for it. Hey, it's Editing Maddie here. I talked to the author, and apparently it is a Cockney British accent with a hint of Australian slang, so hey, I was pretty close. Regardless, she has a cool-ass accent, and in her interactions with the player, we get to learn a little bit more about her history and personality. Like I said in that video, Freedom Planet 2 has a few little side narratives with its hub world characters that you unlock new dialogue for as you progress through the game, and Verse has one of these narratives. Toward the end of the game, she mentions that after learning the world might be about to end, she traveled home to tell her sister that, quote, I'm, well, me. Of course, implying that she is transgender and that this was her traveling home to come out to her family. And because I'm predictable and will desperately cling to any trans or transcoded character in the media I consume, this made me a fierce fan of Verse. In fact, Certified Verse Fan is my current nickname in Galaxy Trail's official Discord server. And this server is where I eventually learned the truth of Verse's origins. See, Verse is not a character original to the Freedom Planet universe. Her appearance there is, in fact, a cameo from a completely different project. One that has consumed 90% of my brain power since I was informed of its existence. Elancia Chronicles. Elancia Chronicles is a series of novels and concept albums written and composed by Leilani Wilson, who you may also know by her old online tag Woofle. She's one of the primary composers for the Freedom Planet games, along with other games like From the information I've been able to dig up about this series, this project initially began with Wilson composing the soundtrack for a hypothetical JRPG she wanted to make, but the project eventually morphed into a series of novels with the concept albums accompanying them. For those who don't know what a concept album is, it's essentially a music album that's created with a narrative or theme across its various songs. Pink Floyd's The Wall and Miracle Musical's Hawaii Part 2 are some well-known examples of this. In the case of Valancia Chronicles, the music came first, but it was always meant to accompany a story. The songs are written with specific characters, locations, or story moments in mind, all formatted in the style of a classic JRPG soundtrack. There are battle themes, cutscene themes, field exploration themes, even opening and credits themes, and they all ooze such a phenomenal sense of style and character. I'll be playing some of the music from the first album in the background of this video, so whenever you see this label in the bottom left corner pop up, that'll tell you what song is currently playing. Most of these songs can also be found on Leilani Wilson's SoundCloud page, and I'll link the playlists for the 4 current albums in the description down below. In case you need a little bit more encouragement, here's some excerpts from my favorite songs in the first album, just to show you how much range this music really has. I've also only just now realized that Transfem Furry pirate music could be sung to the tune of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so do with that what you will. Wilson began uploading music from Elancia Chronicles to her SoundCloud 10 years ago, in 2014, and has been pretty consistently uploading new tracks ever since then. With over 200 songs on the project so far, there's been around 20 hours of music released across this 10-year period. And from what I understand, the project has been in the works for far, far longer than that, for most of Leilani Wilson's life. So, if you needed any more confirmation that this was a major passion project, there you go. Composing that much music in such a variety of styles is an achievement in and of itself, but with an overarching narrative on top of all that, I think my standards for being impressed have been greatly surpassed. As for the novels, those are a slightly more recent development. The first book, Symphony of Shifting Tides, was released in 2019, and follows the adventures of a foxkin former pirate named Verse, as they're landlocked after the sea they and their friend Zan plundered becomes untraversable. They eventually get caught up in a war raging between two countries, Celestian and Decilia, that has sweeping implications as the armies of the land's two major religions pitch in on opposite sides. All the while, Verse is trying to unravel the mystery of their missing memories, and a mysterious individual who shows up in their dreams, claiming to be their sister. And Verse... Oh wait, that was the Freedom Planet NPC we talked about earlier. Dang, what a huge difference in design. In fact, Verse doesn't even look like... Wait a minute. Is this Verse pre-transition? Is this a coming out story? But nah, Verse being a trans woman is very unsubtly hinted at from literally the 12th page of the first book, where it's revealed that she appears as a woman in all of her dreams. Sure. Yeah, she's totally a cis man, you guys. So, for that reason, I'll be referring to her using she/her pronouns for the rest of this video, even though for most of the first and second book, she still presents as a man. It's also only now occurring to me that this video is probably going to release in June, unless some unspeakable horrors happen. Like, oh, I don't know, for example, Adobe accidentally deleting my entire audio file for this review, and then me having to re-record the whole thing. That definitely didn't happen, right? Right? But anyways, if this ends up getting out on time, happy Pride Month from this accidental Pride Month video. Remember, every trans person becomes trans squared between June 1st and June 30th, and there's not anything you can do to stop us. That's when we have our maximum double jump powers. On the subject of the other books, though, there are currently 3, with a 4th one in the works. The aforementioned Symphony of Shifting Tides, Symphony of Hunted Truths, Symphony of Awakened Gods, and the upcoming 4th book under the working title Symphony of the Frontier. The first 3 books were released under Gull Publishing, a furry literature, publishing company, alongside digital releases of each book's album. But unfortunately, Gull went out of business, which has made tracking down the novels an extremely difficult task. The only place I've been able to find any of them is on Fenris Publishing's website, and even there, I was only able to get the first book before they sold out of them all. So for this video, we'll be focusing on just Symphony of Shifting Tides. If anything changes and the books become available for purchase again, I'll be sure to share that down in the pinned comments. Before we get started on diving deeper into this though, I'd like to extend a massive thank you to 2 individuals who were instrumental in the creation of this video. First is Raranoa Zoo. I'm told that this pun is a One Piece reference that I don't quite understand, so if it is, I know you're watching, Raranoa, so if you wanna, go tell me in the comments if that's true. Feel free, I guess. Anyways, she's compiled a ton of information about the series online. She created the Steam guide explaining Versus Cameo and Freedom Planet 2, which is part of what led me to this series in the first place, as well as made extensive TV tropes pages for every book in the series. The biggest thing I care about with this video is making sure that this series is known and preserved, and not lost to the infinite sea of the internet, and she's done a ton of work toward that goal. The second person I'd like to thank is, of course, Leilani Wilson herself, because as soon as she heard I was working on this project, she leapt at the chance to help me throughout the entire process. She helped me get my hands on copies of the second and third books, which I'll probably be making videos on eventually. She provided all of the music files I used here, shared a ton of concept and in-progress art for the series by interior artist Renz, whose Twitter I've linked down in the description and whose art you'll see throughout the video. She also answered basically every question I had about the series, and it's made the process of creating this video so much easier. Thank you for being so helpful with this, and for creating the series that I've come to love, and hopefully many other people will too. I should also warn you that these books are all incredibly adult. There's a lot of graphic violence, adult humor, and triggering subjects, so if you're not an adult or if you're easily triggered by such topics, I suggest you click off the video now. I also haven't exactly reviewed a book before, so I apologize if anything I say here is incoherent or makes no sense. I'm used to reviewing games, movies, and TV shows, not books, and even then the movies and TV shows are a little bit more on the back burner. I'd like to get back into reviewing those soon. I have a few ideas. We'll see about that. But anyways, this is a bit of a departure for me, so bear with me, but damn if I ain't at least gonna try. I'm going to get into describing the characters and their dynamics with one another in a moment, and I'll be keeping spoilers to a minimum for now. There'll be a big spoiler blowout section later on in the video where my ramblings will probably be even more incoherent, so stick around if you want to see that. First though, I would like to touch on the writing style of this series, as I think that's part of what lends it so much charm, at least in my mind. Despite being a fantasy novel at its core, and taking place in a setting inspired by the mid to late 1800s, most of the characters use modern slang and mannerisms frequently throughout their dialogue, and it leads to some incredibly funny interactions, like this one. Oh, and fair warning right now, I'm gonna be doing some incredibly cringy character voices for some of the passages I read aloud for the book, so I apologize in advance for my shitty British accent. "Excuse me, sirs," the bat asked, closing the doors behind them. "Where might your sacks be?" Verse froze, one foot lifting to take a step, and then dropping. "Sacks?" Zan asked. He was a few steps further into the foyer than Verse, but looked poised to bolt. "We make a right turn here," the rabbit whispered. "Down the hall, past the fountain. Got it?" "You remember this place that well," the fox whispered. "Wasn't it like several years ago?" "The sacks in which..." The bat paused, burping. "You keep your salt. Your salty sacks, if you will." "In your fucking mouth, bitch!" shouted Zan. He grabbed Verse's hand and ran. I personally think this writing style works really well when the books are trying to be more goofy, which they do very well. There's a lot of serious subject matter in these books, lots of genuinely depressing stuff, so when the book takes these more lighthearted moments, the added punch of dissonance between the setting and the dialogue makes it feel a lot more fun. The book genuinely had me bursting out laughing during a lot of these scenes, and it's part of what made it work so well for me. If you needed more convincing that this was a good thing, the word fuck is said 193 times in this book, and I guarantee more than 2/3 of them were from Zan. In addition to this, these books are incredibly fast-paced. You miss a sentence or two, you'll probably be lost. I personally feel like this level of density adds to the experience, since, as someone with a short attention span, it forces me to actually thoroughly read the book if I want to understand what's going on. Might not be for everyone, but I was a huge fan at least. Lastly, it's important to note that going into this book, you aren't really going to be getting a complete story. A lot of the mysteries it builds up serve to create intrigue and introduce concepts for the future books to continue, so this one very much suffers from being the first book. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it gives us some fantastic interactions between the main cast of characters, their adversaries and allies, as well as a great introduction to the world of Valancia through this conflict. Speaking of the main cast of characters, though, let's start with none other than our snarky pirate protagonist, Verse, whose full name is actually Versaeren. A lot of Verse's history is shrouded in mystery, and I only just now realized that rhymes, but anyways, that's due to her amnesia, and some of it is revealed throughout the course of the book, so I can't really get into too much with her. But suffice it to say, she is the glue that holds this book together. Verse is a very troubled young woman, heavy in denial of her identity, though she hides it behind a carefree mask. The start of the novel sees her and Zan operating as pirates around the Basker continent, having met as part of a larger group of pirates a few years back, and the two of them having a pretty deep bond as a result of their time spent together. Unfortunately, her time sailing with that group also instilled a lot of toxically masculine traits in Verse as she attempted to bury her desire to be a woman, and her harsh, uncaring nature and lack of value for her own life at the start of the book is a result of this. However, that's not the only side to Verse showcased throughout the novel. Far from it. Most chapters of the book feature a section where Verse dreams about her homeland of Kurlinsia, and during these dreams, she not only appears as a woman, but interacts with another foxkin claiming to be her sister, Lyricos. We'll get more into her later, but her presence changes Verse for the better in most of these scenes. She goes from being cold and uncaring to feeling more like a genuine person, and this is where we're able to see how deeply Verse truly cares about the people she's close to. Not to mention Lyricos is aggressively supportive of Verse's identity, and the biggest thing keeping Verse grounded through all of her hardships. Additionally, we get a peek into Verse's inner monologue at the end of, and sometimes throughout, each chapter via her diary entries. This goes more into how she actually feels about the events going on around her in her own voice, and it really helps us connect with her character in a different way, compared to the interactions described through the third person in the book. One of the other coolest things is that most of the music in the series is canonically composed by Verse. And of course, due to the setting it wouldn't sound exactly the same, but the fact that's even a detail the creator considered is incredibly cool to me. One of the most obvious examples of this is Battle Theme number 1, Throwdown, versus its guitar counterpart, which is the in-universe version of the song as performed by Verse. However, Verse isn't the only major character we're introduced to in the prologue, as we also get our first appearance of the aforementioned Zan. This guy is such a bro, he literally dyed himself green just to make Verse feel a little bit less awkward about her unnatural purple fur color, and it's a treat basically any time Zan is on screen. Rude, crude, and one hell of a dude, Zan seems pretty self-centered for the first half of the book. He seems to only really care about himself and Verse, and will chase off anyone who tries to derail their plans. He cares more deeply about Verse and the people around him more than he'll ever willingly let on, though. He doesn't get quite as much development as some of the other cast members do throughout the book, but he does have an interesting change of heart around the middle that brings he and Verse's friendship into a bit of a rough patch, leading to one of my favorite scenes in the book. But right now, we're still here discussing the main characters, and said discussion is far from complete. In fact, here we have one of my favorite characters in the entire novel, our favorite little creature, Cecilia. I fucking love Cecilia. Seriously, though, Cecilia reminds me a lot of how I used to be when I was in early high school, like, uncomfortably so. She's basically me, but if I'd realized I was a girl a lot sooner. And knew magic. And was a bat. Cecilia is a mysterious girl that Verse and Zan bump into relatively early in the book, and then upon being rescued from a pair of assassins by them, she just kind of follows them around for the rest of the book. Like, I'm not even joking. Half her early moments are Verse and Zan thinking, oh, surely if we do this thing, she'll finally leave us alone. Only for her to still be there hours later. Did you get it to turn around? He asked. Nope, said Zan. She's still back there. I figure she'll get bored eventually. I mean, the road up this pass looks pretty long. By the time we get to the summit, she'll probably have fucked off toward home. She didn't. Cecilia has an interesting role throughout the story, as despite living in Celestian, the country allied with the army of the Elian Church, Cecilia despises Elia and Elianism for very justifiable reasons. She's the only member of the main party to be directly opposed to the Elian Church, which bans the use of magic and preaches that beastkin are born tainted due to the actions of their ancestors, calling for them to repent by rejecting their animalistic traits. So, naturally, as a dedicated mage and a batkin, not to mention some more spoilerish stuff we'll get into later, Cecilia has some pretty major issues with that. And considering that our two remaining party members are members of the Holy Army, naturally that leads to quite a bit of squabbling and turmoil within the group. She also has very minimal social skills, wears the same clothes for literal days in a row, and is, canonically, stinky. She's just like me for real. Her lack of social awareness consistently leads to some of the most hilarious scenes in the book, as the other characters try to keep up with her line of thought and understand the reasoning behind a lot of her actions. She also writes uncomfortably spicy fanfiction about her friends, which leads to some, odd behavior later in the book. Cecilia is incredibly impressionable and looks up to Verse and Karina, who we'll talk about later, but sometimes the traits she picks up from them aren't really the best ones. Although she does go from asking what fuck means at the beginning of the book to starting a letter in the epilogue with sup bitch, so I mean, at least she's learning some of the right stuff from them. On the subject of those two remaining party members though, first up is Basil. As the seventh in a line of chosen ones, Basil has a lot of pressure riding on him, and is desperate for a chance to prove himself. Unfortunately for him, he's, not exactly great with responsibility. Growing up with little agency and a family reputation that pushed others his age away, Basil has no idea how to be anything but the chosen one, and he can't even do that correctly. Because of that, he ends up spending most of his time either drinking to forget or fighting in the arena, until the conflict between Celestian and Cecilia breaks out. Basil kind of sits as a background element for the first half or so of the book, mostly being a means to advance the plot and get Verse, Zan, and by extension Cecilia more and more wrapped up in the conflict. But in some later parts of the book, he really starts to come into his own as a character. Basil's arc here mostly feels like setup for what his character will become later, and I don't really have a problem with that due to how much said setup excites me. Again, more on that later. Finally, we have another really compelling character, Karina. Like Verse, Karina's past is very much a key part of the narrative, and she has one of the most extensive backstories of the main cast, so I can't really get into a lot of her story without spoiling it. But what I can say is that she's one tough gal. This dog woman is serving as Basil's bodyguard when we first encounter her in the story, and one of the most immediately striking things about her is her size. Karina stands at least a head above even the tallest characters in the book, and her intense training caused her to become just as bulky and muscular. So, her figure is pretty intimidating. However, Karina is actually pretty soft-spoken and reserved, hanging back from the rest of the group and being incredibly cagey around anyone except for Basil. This is mainly because of her going through some major trauma in her past, resulting in her being incredibly emotionally scarred and reshaping herself into an arbiter of true justice. So, basically giant dog girl Batman. However, there is a softer side to Karina that isn't seen very often, and her connections with Verse and her arc make for a very intriguing mystery throughout the novel. These five make up the main party of the book, and their whole dynamic is a large part of what makes the story so enjoyable. Verse desperately clinging to Zan and eventually Karina, Cecilia looking up to basically everyone except for Basil, who she despises, Basil being oblivious to the fact that everyone but Karina hates him at first. Their banter is absolutely hilarious, and when all five of them are together is where the book shines the most. There isn't really one pairing of characters who don't get a moment to shine, except maybe Zan and Karina? But like, if you asked me to tell you what Verse's dynamic with Basil is, or Cecilia's dynamic with Zan, or Basil's with Karina, at any point in the book, I could tell you exactly how they feel about each other. And I think that's a major testament to how well characterized they all are. It doesn't help that, like, basically everyone in the group has a crush on someone else, if not multiple people at the same time, which just adds to the hilarity of some of these scenes. All five of these characters also have a single chapter dedicated to them, classified as interludes, where it dives into the most detail about their backstories and personal histories. These can range from mostly recapping information we already know, but diving into these characters' emotional states during those times, to... oh my god. However, these five naturally aren't the only characters who make up the story. There's, of course, the supporting characters, like the aforementioned Lyricos, who appears in Verse's dreams and very clearly knows a lot about Verse's past. Though she seemingly has Verse's best interests in mind, getting information out of her is incredibly difficult, especially when Verse continues to wake up at the most inopportune times in their conversations. Another highlight is Sir Patchmore, the leader of a performing troupe that appears multiple times throughout the story. A showman to his very core, Patchmore's eccentric personality makes him a delight every time he shows up, and he honestly has some really tender emotional moments with Verse that help her process a lot of how she feels about the main five. There's also the book's antagonists, and though the true main villains of the story don't really show up until pretty late, there are a few minor characters who stand in our protagonist's way throughout. For example, there's Stella, a former pirate captain that Verse and Zan sailed under for a few years. She's actually Verse's ex-girlfriend, and it sucks that her design is so cool because she's a massive bigot and she sucks and I hate her. Did I mention she sucks? Anyway, there's also Satyr and Relin, a pair of assassins who work for the Decilian army. They've been sent after Verse and Zan for some unknown reason, and are forced to fight our protagonists multiple times throughout the book. Speaking of fights though, that's another place where the writing of this book really shines. There are a ton of action sequences spread throughout Shifting Tides, and every one of them stands out in a completely different and unique way. The fast pace of the novels is at its strongest here, and every movement is described in a snappy and precise way that gives the fights a frantic energy. I also love that so many of the characters have unique fighting styles. You have all these different characters using different types of medieval weaponry or firearms or different types of magic, and it lends every character to feeling completely unique in battle. A fun tidbit Leilani told me was that back when Elancia was supposed to be a game, each character was supposed to have a melee option and a ranged option in combat, except for Zan, who, in her own words, had close and closer options. One of my favorite fighting styles in the book is, of course, Verse's Manender, which is a revolver with a blade protruding under its muzzle. This lends itself to a totally unique fighting style, with her both using it at long range and up close. Karina is also a standout, going for mostly hand-to-hand combat with her tonfas, but also being a bit of a weapons geek and knowing her way around most firearms. Another personal favorite is Relin, who uses plant magic to conjure vines and keep his opponent tied down. The world of Elancia is also incredibly well defined, even with our limited exposure to it in this first book. Shifting Tides takes place almost entirely on the Basker continent, within the aforementioned nations of Celestion and Decilia, with brief detours to other places through a couple characters' flashbacks or dreams. Both of the main countries seem to be mostly European-inspired, and as mentioned prior, each sides with one of the two opposing major religions. The first is Celestion, which is where our main characters end up in at the start, which is controlled by the Church of Elia. They worship a single goddess, their namesake Elia, and are extraordinarily restrictive in their teachings. They preach that long ago, there were many humans who pushed the use of advanced technologies and magic further than Elia allowed, and as a result, they and their descendants were cursed with beastkin forms, and that in order to prove their purity, they must resist the temptation to use the abilities that come with these forms. For example, Basil, for most of the book, refuses to utilize his wings, despite being a bat kid, since he views it as sinful. The Elian Church is definitely the most prominent throughout the novel. There are various characters who point out its flaws and issues, and others who are completely devout and struggle to find where they draw the line with their beliefs. Given how much characters like Cecilia talk about the true history of the world, going far against Elianism, I am very curious to see how this is expanded in the other novels. Decilia, meanwhile, follows the Fellowship of the Aegeus. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Leilani was very helpful in trying to help me figure out how to pronounce some of this stuff, but that one I still struggled with a bit, I think. The Aegeus instead follow a pantheon of gods and encourage the free use of magic and technology. However, though they might seem better on the surface, the controlling powers within Decilia and the Aegeus forces abuse this freedom to project their strength across the continent, constructing great weapons and turning on each other at the drop of a hat. We don't get nearly as much focus on the Aegeus, as none of the main party members fight on their side, but there are certainly some interesting ideas presented here that hit more toward that true history I mentioned earlier. And this is especially true of some of the other religious groups that introduced later in the novel. We also get brief glimpses at a few other nations, most notably the Kurlinzian Empire, an Asian-inspired nation that serves as the homeland of both Verse and Karina. In Verse's dreams, this is where she meets up with Lyricos, on the tiny island of Kaimusu where she was born. We don't see much of this nation in terms of their culture, but we do know that many of the villagers on Kaimusu specifically worship the water goddess Lament, who was notably not a part of the Aegeus pantheon. They're replaced by a different water god. We also know that there's quite a division between those in the upper class and mainland of Kurlinzia, and from those out in the more isolated rural areas, particularly with Kaimusu, as it isn't a part of any of the Empire's main prefectures. On a different note, though, one of the biggest core aspects I enjoyed of this book is the way its various queer characters are depicted. Verse is, of course, the most obvious, being the protagonist of the book, and the way her gender identity is explored in this book is just, it's so good. Verse falling so naturally into her feminine self when she falls asleep, but then being jarred when she wakes up in a quote-unquote male body, is such a natural thing for pre-questioning trans people, and it's just the day-to-day stuff of presenting as a gender that doesn't match who you really are that's so well done here. And Verse very much knows she'd rather be a woman throughout the book, but she's so convinced that it's unattainable that she represses it as much as she can, which leads perfectly into my favorite part of the video. Welcome to Verse Egg Moments. For those who aren't familiar with what the hell this means, and honestly I don't blame you, egg is a term used in the trans community to refer to a person before they've realized they're trans. So when a person refers to something that helped them realize they were trans, they'd say their egg cracked. Usually it's used to discuss oneself pre-transition, but in this case, since it's a fictional character we know will eventually transition, I'll be using that term here. And when I say egg moment, I mean very obvious hints that Verse is a trans woman, knowing what we know about the plot. And don't worry about spoilers, there won't be anything major discussed in this section. So, without further ado, everything was gone, even Verse's dress. He looked very much like the Verse of his dreams, just flat-chested and angry. Gross. That's me. Awkward and weird. Awkward. Verse being hypercritical of her reflection in a drinking glass. Verse reading cheesy romance novels. Verse dreaming about having to describe herself in one word as a child, and after she's bullied for wearing a dress, describes herself as garbage. Hey, what are you two talking about? Boy stuff? She asked, stretching her wings out. Yup, no girls allowed, said Zan, riding ahead. Verse hung back. Verse claiming she grew out of wanting to be a girl. He told her all of his deepest, darkest secrets, and she saw parts of him he was afraid to let anyone else see. She understood parts of him that no one else could, and made him feel safe. She didn't see him as the horrid, awkward mess that he was, uncomfortable in his own fur. She saw him as something Verse knew was unattainable in this life. Mr. Verse? That was Cecilia's voice. Just Verse, please. the fox mumbled. No, mister. The entirety of interlude verse. Of course, I'm also bloody purple, so I suppose I'm just a freak. Worse yet, I'm a freak who thinks he's a girl. Never mind. Various moments of internalized homophobia. Verse immediately gravitating toward the feminine clothes when she needs a disguise. Apparently, that's a recurring thing. Verse immediately gaining confidence when she sees her reflection in said disguise. Your outfit's really cute, Cecilia added. You look just like a real woman. Verse's face felt hot, and he swallowed any words that could have come out of his snout. Thanks, he heard himself say. You make a fetching young woman, Sir Verse, the bat added. You too, Verse mumbled, not even registering what he'd heard. Verse longing for a dress in the window of a shop. Verse, for his part, swam around in only his pants, as he often did, and was embarrassed about his body being seen. As such, he stayed mostly underwater. Lastly, before we discuss spoilers, I'd like to touch on the aforementioned art of the series. Leilani has commissioned a ton of art for the series, but the cover art and interior art are most of what you'll be seeing, unless you dive deeper into the furry depths of the internet like I have. I've been stuck here for years, God please help. Renz's work on the interior illustrations is fantastic, and is most of what I've been putting in the background of this video. It lends the action scenes a great extra punch, with some of my favorites being this one of Verse fighting Relin, or this one of Verse kicking ass in one of her disguises. The style of the line work in these illustrations is pretty inconsistent, with some being a lot sketchier, but others being simpler with bolder lines. But overall, I think this inconsistency actually works really well, giving each scene a distinct feel. My cat has come to see me in the middle of recording. We have been blessed. Some of the illustrations for the calmer scenes are genuinely just adorable too, and it never really felt like the characters in the illustrations didn't match the image the text created in my head. Renz also did a ton of concept artwork for the series, as well as some art uploaded alongside the music on SoundCloud, all of which I just adore. It's really cool getting to see some of these illustrations and characters in their full color glory. The same, however, cannot be said about Nightline Z's cover art. Now, don't get me wrong, on a technical level this art is extremely well made. However, even by the author's own admission, it's quite off model, and that's not exactly hard to see when comparing these designs to the ones in Renz's art, where he worked much closer with Leilani throughout the entire process, and is much more familiar with the characters overall. Like, why is Karina shorter than Cecilia? She's supposed to be ridiculously tall. And Verse is like extra turquoise here. I think they took that design element a bit too far. Like I said, it's not bad art, it's just way off model. Apparently this is because the series publisher chose the cover artist, which definitely tracks. I was also shown some of the art that was originally intended to be used on the cover by Renz, and I definitely like this a lot more. At this point though, I'm going to be starting the spoiler section, so if you have yet to read the first book in this lovely series and you plan to, I highly suggest clicking off this video now. And while you're at it, if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, go ahead and drop a like and comment down below what piques your interest about the series the most, and subscribe so you catch future videos. I'm prepping to move into a new apartment, so I could definitely use a little boost in income from this video doing well. I'll also almost definitely be doing more videos like this one in the future, and I've got that aforementioned almost hour-long review of Spider-Man 2 in the works, so I'd really appreciate it if y'all came back for those. Without further ado, though, spoilers start in 3, 2, 1. So I'm kinda just gonna go through major plot beats and character arcs and gush about what I love about them so much, not really in any particular order, more so just as they come to me. My lack of taking notes throughout the process of making this video is really gonna bite me in the ass here, but at least I have my incoherent Discord ramblings to both Leilani and to my general friend group to back me up a little. Anyway, what do you mean Lyricos was erasing Verse's memories? I mean, I get it. This isn't the kind of story where you can have a character that's just a perfect paragon. Everyone's gotta be complex, and I do love the mystery this book builds up with Lyricos and eventually their brother Arya, even if it doesn't really resolve in this book. I was just absolutely crushed because of the one super supportive person in Verse's life at that point being turned a lot more morally gray and suspicious. Speaking of Arya though, I like this guy a whole lot. As soon as he gets introduced, the whole plotline with Lyricos gets really intriguing, and his involvement really brings a lot of Lyricos' goals into question. He and Verse's dynamic is also just a lot of fun in the scenes they share together, especially when they're fighting off the monsters in one of her dreams. This dynamic is also the source of one of my favorite interactions in the entire book. One that I absolutely cannot read on screen for fear of getting demonetized, so, here. the subject of people liking men, holy fuck, Basil, I'm so sorry. For the last half of the book or so, a lot of scenes depict him grappling with the fact that he wants to ensure his family has an heir, given the whole chosen one bloodline thing. Because of this, he rushes into a marriage with Karina at the end of the book, because he's convinced himself that he loves her, even though it is very clear that Basil is not actually attracted to her, and that Basil would much rather be in a relationship with Verse, who, again, is presenting as a man at this point, or Zan. Verse actually develops feelings for Basil as well, and Basil does seemingly reciprocate those feelings before shutting himself down, because, well, guess why? As you've probably guessed, the Church of Elia bans homosexuality, and Basil, as a Celestian hero, is a devout follower of Elianism. So naturally, he does the very common homophobic religion thing of compulsory heterosexuality. I'm not excited to see how this affects Basil and Karina's relationship in their next adventures, especially since it seems like Karina genuinely does have feelings for him. But I am excited to see Basil hopefully learn and eventually grow, coming to accept himself. It'll certainly be interesting to see him and Verse interact again once she transitions, though, that's for sure. But at least we got Karina slaying in her wedding dress, so that's one good thing coming out of all this. Before we talk about Karina, though, one more thing on the whole Elia situation. I gotta say how refreshing it is to actually see more fantasy queer media that doesn't act like the world around them is just totally okay with queer people. Not that there's anything wrong with stories like that, of course. There's a place for settings where being queer is normalized, and some of my favorite queer stories are in settings like that. But I appreciate the attention to detail in the world building, as letting queer characters struggle against these sorts of systems that oppress their identities can also lend itself very well to different types of queer stories. It's cathartic to watch a character struggle against the same sorts of things that queer people in the real world have struggled with, and not only survive, but thrive. Another piece of media that does this really well is Avatar: The Last Airbender, in its extended material. I have a lot of experience with DMing the tabletop RPG based on the series, Avatar Legends, which is fantastic by the way, and you should totally check it out. And one thing I was really impressed by in the core book for that is how they explicitly call out how the different nations feel about and treat people with different identities at varying points in the story. The Avatar Kyoshi and Yang Chen novels also touch on this a bit, with Kyoshi herself being bisexual, and I just love seeing characters say, "Nah, I'm gonna do my own thing," when society tells them they can't be queer. But anyway, Karina. Karina has been through some shit. She and Verse's interludes were easily my two favorites because they revealed a ton about these characters that we didn't already know. But the fact that when she was kidnapped for ransom, the person who rescued her ended up being Lyricos? Even if she was using a different name, the whole thing created such an intriguing link between Karina and Verse, making their dynamic my absolute favorite throughout this book. And you can tell how much Verse trusts Lyricos, because after Zan decides to go and keep fighting alongside Basil, Verse is adamant in refusing to come along until Lyricos turns around and says she needs to be there to protect Karina. This also leads to another one of my favorite interactions in the book, where Verse and Karina share a dream with Lyricos, and Karina sees Verse's female dream self for the first time. Once again, I cannot voice it aloud because you know why, so here's a screenshot once again. Verse and Karina are so fucking stupid and I love them. There's another point earlier in the book where the two are just hanging out on a bridge and Verse looked her over for a moment longer before looking down at himself. Slowly, he stood and moved closer to her, before very gently reaching out and awkwardly brushing her cheek with a hand. He held it there for what felt like a year. It was only half a second though. Probably. "Got it," he said, quickly pocketing the hand, his face feeling hot. Karina met his eye for a moment. Maybe he had held his hand there too long, and she'd want to kill him or something. Why do I always do this? I'm worse than fucking Lisa, or any Granthane character for that matter. "Gotta go," said the fox, before turning and running to his side of the bridge. It wasn't that tall, and there was water below. As such, it was easy to hop right over the edge and into the water to disappear. These two had better fucking kiss eventually, I swear to God. In terms of the actual plot, though, honestly, I don't have a lot to say. The character dynamics and relationships are what kept me so invested in the book, plus how well defined the setting they inhabit is. Though there are a few scenes that I really loved. There's this sequence in the middle section of the book where the party is getting ready to try and assassinate the Decilian prince at his wedding, and on the way there, Verse naturally immediately volunteers to disguise herself in a dress alongside the musicians. She also has a chat with Zan here, after he decided to go and continue the fight against Decilia, and it really helps me understand the bond these two have way more, making it one of my favorite scenes in the book. The wedding scene itself is also just, like, devastating with how wrong it goes, to the point of almost being darkly funny. Plus, getting to see Verse kick ass in a dress is always a treat. Another one of my favorite scenes is with Basil and Verse, when they attempt to destroy Decilia's Aegeus cannon. Despite this whole set piece just being awesome, introducing some sci-fi elements to the series, as the cannon is built using star junk, i.e. parts from a spacecraft, the whole part with Verse having to convince Basil to use his wings to glide and save their lives shows the beginnings of Basil's future arc in one of the coolest ways possible. He even uses his wings again at the end of the book, and I just... Throughout the book, we also get some concerning scenes with the way Verse can get extremely aggressive in some fights, especially when her friends are in life-threatening danger. Like, her entire personality shifts. And this is definitely something that's going to be important later, considering how Verse gruesomely murders one of the book's main antagonists, Ryadel, toward the end, using water magic she shouldn't have been capable of. The first book doesn't provide the full context for this, but it definitely builds up more intrigue for me. I also loved learning more about Cecilia and her history throughout the book, with her parents having assassinated a large chunk of the Celestian royal family, and her being forced to change her name and live with her grandfather to be allowed to live, despite being a child at the time. She also worships a god outside of both Elia and the Aegeus pantheon, the god of shadows, with us eventually learning that she's descended from him. Cecilia definitely feels like a very exposition-heavy character for a lot of the book, but her personality is entertaining enough that it keeps it fun, and the larger lore mysteries she clues the party in on are definitely something I'm excited to see play out. She also gets a killer new outfit at the end of the book, and it just makes me so happy to watch her grow and mature throughout the story, even if there are some uncomfortable phases. She gets a badass sword to kill the final boss though, so love that for her. And finally, there's said final boss in the form of Fate. This character is absent for most of the book, but slowly throughout the last half, you can see his influence washing over Decilia as their relationship with the Fellowship starts to collapse. And when he eventually does show up, damn does he make a fantastic impression. He's one of those characters where he likes to tease the protagonists with having knowledge they don't, and considering he's a god, he makes for one hell of an opponent. When the party fights him in person in the cave, that's already a super exciting scene, but when he manages to stab Verse in the eye, yes, this is how she loses it, and the battle transitions into Verse's dream world, ooh, that's when I start to love this chapter. Lyricos fighting off Fate as best she can, aggressively defending Verse as Fate dehumanizes her for being trans, with it all ending in Verse's connection to Lyricos being completely cut off. It kept my jaw dropped the entire time. The end of the battle with Fate's third eye being embedded where Verse's original eye was, and her beginning to have visions of the future that lead her to return to Kerlinzia. What a fantastic way to end the book, while keeping readers excited for the next one. The rest of the party being all split up as well, with Zan having followed Verse to Kerlinzia, but Verse splitting off from him, Cecilia attempting to go find them but getting on the wrong boat, and Basil going off in pursuit of her, all with Karina being left behind on her own. It just sets up a fantastically satisfying web of conflicts for when they all reunite. But with that said, I think that's finally all I have to say on Symphony of Shifting Tides. This excellent first book has already gotten me so invested in Elancia Chronicles, and I'm super excited to see where it goes next. In fact, I couldn't stop myself from starting Hunted Truths already while I was writing this script, and now I've almost finished the book at the time of recording this, so you can definitely count on more Elancia videos in the future. On an unrelated note, I would say expect my video output to continue to be slow over the summer, cause I'll be working a full-time job at a summer camp once again. And also expect for Twitch streams to stop completely until August. I'm hoping to get back to bi-weekly uploads again soon, but we'll see if that actually ends up working out or not. And once I come back, I hope to have a definitive stream schedule as well, so you can know exactly when and what I'll be streaming. I've really missed making more YouTube videos like this, and I guess a Transfem Furry pirate novel was exactly what I needed to distract me from my schoolwork long enough to make this. Thanks again to Leilani Wilson for being so helpful with this project. The video genuinely would not have come out this detailed if not for her. And that's all I have for you today. You all have a fantastic Pride Month, and a lovely rest of your day.